little bit with a bit more sunshine here during Wednesday, feeling quite pleasant, I suspect, in western Scotland. Low pressure continues to dominate, bands of wet and windy weather swinging north this week, but coming from the south, it's always going to stay pretty mild.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hey, welcome along on tonight's Mark Steyn Show. Who do you think should be the next Prime Minister? Wait a minute, didn't we do this story last month? Ah, goodness. Welcome to Groundhog Day in Westminster. Because this show talks about things like all the injuries and deaths from the COVID vaccines, fellas like the BBC's Dr. Matthew Sweet says we're enthralled to conspiracy theories, and he reports us to Ofcom. But if you really wanted to make people fall for conspiracy theories, wouldn't you do what the British establishment has just done? You scheme and leak against the sitting Prime Minister until you force him out. Then you arrange a leadership contest between two of the most unprepossessing candidates one could come up with, even if they'd been manufactured by the Chicoms in the Wuhan Institute of Animatronic Humanoids. And then you make party members devote the entire summer to choosing between them in an interminable neither-of-the-above contest. And then, after the winner's been in office for 6 weeks, for 4 of which politics ground to a complete halt in order to mourn our late sovereign, you say, OK, the winner's done, she's toast, she's sleeping with the fishes, and the most powerful man in government is now a fellow so unpopular he couldn't even make it through the first round of the so-called leadership, so-called election. So this is either a conspiracy or that's just what they want us to think. We're going to kick it around with Patrick O'Flynn and Toby Young. And historian David Starkey is here to give us the panoramic sweep back into the mists of time and such early primitive prime ministerships as those of David Cameron and Theresa May before the job was term limited to 2 months. If you wanted to confirm the conspiracy theory that only globalist puppets can be permitted to govern Western societies, a fellow whose wife is a presenter on Chinese commie TV and who has to Eurostar it back from Brussels to be sworn in as Chancellor is, if anything, a tad too obvious. You'd want something subtler than that if this was a novel or a play or a movie, rather than mere humdrum Westminster reality. We're going to take up some of the consequences of globalist government with Ava Valadingerbroek. Oh, there she is, our favourite Hilversum milkmaid. And John O'Sullivan is here too. He never poses with milk bottles. There he is, John O'Sullivan, long-time advisor to Mrs Thatcher. Poor old Trussie is unlikely to be around long enough to acquire any long-time advisors, or indeed even short-time advisors. So do make the most of John O'Sullivan. Coming up, plus the most vital part of the show, all the more important when we live in the constant swirl of a blizzard of lies, your comments and questions. Give it your best. Be as personally vicious about me as you want to be. I can take it. Actually, I can't. I'm riddled with self-doubt on the best of days, but David Starkey can take it, so you can always pick on him instead. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, Twitter me at gbnews, but first, as ever, the latest news with Polly Middlehurst. All yours, Polly.
Mark, thank you, and good evening to you. The latest news headlines, as you've been hearing. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has been in the House of Commons today, and he's been warning MPs about future decisions of eye-watering difficulty, as he detailed how he's now dropped most of the pledges made by Kwasi Kwarteng in the mini-budget 3 weeks ago. In an emergency statement designed to calm financial markets, Jeremy Hunt announced in the Commons that the plans to cap the cost of energy for 2 years would now end in April, with more targeted support for households. He also announced scrapping the planned cut of 1 pence to the basic income tax rate will now stay at 20p. The pound and the financial markets did rally following the announcements, but the Chancellor warned there were more difficult decisions ahead.
This government will take the difficult decisions necessary to ensure there is trust and confidence in our national finances. That means decisions of eye-watering difficulty. But I give the House and the public this assurance: every single one of those decisions, whether reductions in spending or increases in tax, will be shaped through core, compassionate, conservative values that will prioritise the needs of the most vulnerable.
Well, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, accused the government of losing credibility following the change in plans. Here's what she said.
On Friday, the unedifying spectacle of the Chancellor being dragged back from the IMF before he could do any more damage to our economy. So she has turned to a new Chancellor, who finished 8th out of 8 in the Tory leadership contest, winning just 18 votes from MPs. The Tories have run out of credibility, and now they are running out of chancellors.
Well, in news away from politics today, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley says hundreds of police officers should be sacked following a new report commissioned after the death of Sarah Everard. A review of the Met's internal misconduct system found officers were getting away with criminal behaviour owing to an anything-goes attitude. The report described some police procedures as racist and misogynistic as well. Sir Mark Rowley said he was appalled by the findings, and he apologised to officers and members of the public who he thought might have been let down. Lastly, a Manchester United footballer was denied bail today and will spend over a month in custody. Mason Greenwood is charged with attempted rape, controlling and coercive behaviour and assault. The 21-year-old was first held in January over allegations relating to a young woman after images and videos were shared on social media. He was immediately suspended from playing or training with the Old Trafford club. That's it. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio as well. You're with GB News, the People's Channel, where now it's time for Mark Steyn.
Thank you, Bolly. Liz Truss wanted to be the new Thatcher, and she has achieved that in just one respect, like Mrs. Thatcher, she has been done in by her colleagues. In Mrs. T's case, it took the backstabbers 11 years to pull that off. In Miss Truss's case, it took 11 days, give or take. Here is the Leader of the House subbing for the PM at question time.
All we know right now is, unless she tells us otherwise, that the Prime Minister is cowering under her desk and asking for it all to go away. Isn't it about time she did and let somebody else who can make decisions in the British national interest get in charge instead?
Yeah. Well, the Prime Minister is not under a desk, as the Honourable Lady. I can assure the House.
She's good, vicious, but good. So if you've just landed from planet Zongo and you're wondering how a sophisticated, advanced parliamentary democracy like the United Kingdom works, well, as Bagehot famously put it, the Constitution is divided between the dignified and the efficient parts. The efficient part isn't in the least bit efficient, and the dignified part is increasingly entirely undignified. But be that as it may, there is a ceremonial head who gets to go around waving her hand and carrying her handbag and preserving ancient cultural traditions such as Irish step dancing. Oh, she's rather good at that. And going among her people, such as this recently unemployed black man now being retrained for casual construction site work. Meanwhile, all the policy decisions are made by a so-called head of government who, as in Germany, is known as a chancellor. In this case, like Bismarck, he's an iron chancellor, ruthless and all-powerful. UK's new finance minister reverses all of Liz Truss's tax cuts. Oh, don't worry. As with the loopier Ottoman sultans, such as Mustafa I, who sat in a cage with 2 concubines, giggling at them all day long, Liz is still permitted to sit in a padded, windowless room protected by court eunuchs in case she gets hold of something she might harm herself with. With the Ottoman sultans, it was sharp objects such as cutthroat razors. With Liz, it's access to the Conservative Party Twitter feed, which is fortunately now safely in the hands of Chancellor von Hunt. Look at this. The most important objective for our country right now is stability, says Jeremy Hunt. Indeed. That's why we overthrow the leader every month. Patrick O'Flynn is a former MEP and he writes for The Spectator. What's going on here, Patrick?
Well, I think you characterised it rather well. People are calling it a coup. Well, if it's a coup, it has to be said that, you know, Liz Truss is not blameless here, and nor is Kwasi Kwarteng. They led with their chins. People weren't prepared to lend the British government money at affordable rates anymore, and that was always going to cause trouble. But I'm particularly perplexed at where did Jeremy Hunt emerge from? As far as I know, he's got no Treasury ministerial experience. The dynamics between him and the Prime Minister, as we still laughingly call her, they don't suggest she's picked him. He's emerged, and he's emerged with a full agenda in his back pocket. So he must have had lots of conversations with people in the Treasury, at the Bank of England. And so it really is a case of the unelected state. And he couldn't have less of a popular mandate. As people are saying, he was first out of this leadership contest. He was thrashed by Boris 3 years ago. He was part of the Theresa May administration which lost a majority, not part of the Boris Johnson one that won it back with plenty to spare. So he's kind of uniquely divorced from what used to be the Tory electorate. I don't know how many of them are left anymore. And I think this is the most disquieting thing. Where did he come from? I mean, I think he's been a good talker today and over the weekend. He's gone about his grisly agenda with some degree of fluency and enthusiasm. But the mystery is, it's got nothing to do with democracy. Where did he come from?
Well, I don't want to go all boringly constitutionally pedantic about this, Patrick, but as I understand it, Liz Truss remains the King's First Minister, so under our system of government, isn't she the one who invites the guy who gets to be Chancellor of the Exchequer? If it wasn't Liz, who the hell put this guy in harness?
Exactly. You know, I don't definitely know it wasn't her, but I can tell from her, I was going to say body language, it's more like face language, isn't it? The sort of gawping, stunned goldfish look that she's brought into being today. It's obviously not a considered move by her, and he's a guy who's negating every single major economic policy that she unveiled with her mate a couple of weeks ago. So I am very troubled by this. I think it's very, very hard to say that the Conservative Party deserves to remain in power or has got anything much left to offer. They're totally inconsistent. They come up with a new vision, you know, as often as some people change their socks. You know, the only thing which leads one to hesitate saying kick them out is the state of the alternatives.
Well, you made a rather good point, I think it was on Twitter over the weekend, in response to some fellow arguing, I can't even remember who these guys are. Ben, I think, in fact, The Sun put the wrong picture on their front page. I think this was Ben What's-His-Face and as the steady pair of hands. And you made the rather obvious point to this guy that in a functioning democracy, our leaders should connect with the voters at some level. Theresa May never did. Boris Johnson did. Liz Truss doesn't appear to, really, and nor does Rishi Sunak. Does this guy, Jeremy Hunt, connect with voters?
Absolutely not, beyond a narrow coterie of, you know, the home counties, slightly posh David Cameron set. Yeah, a Prime Minister has to connect. So now the Tory party is madly looking round, and some people are saying, you know, Ben Wallace, who's a safe pair of hands, probably perfectly good at defence, but most people don't know who he is. He couldn't communicate his way out of a paper bag. Suella Braverman, the latest darling of the right, I don't think her communication skills are up to it, and they got rid of Boris Johnson, a consummate communicator, without a plan about who was going to step in. So they have blown this once-in-a-generation realignment of British politics. People up in the Red Wall, the working-class voters there, have been looking askance not only at the economic carnage, but also the failure to control our borders, particularly illegal immigration, and, you know, turning up to the max on legal immigration. This is just breaking, you know, every agenda, every promise, a party in chaos and panic. As I say, it's very, very hard, even from someone from my standpoint, to say that the Labour Party would actually be any worse.
Yeah, and as you point out, it's just 3 years, not yet 3 years, since that big, massive realignment. And if one were conspiratorially inclined, Patrick, one might think that they had been determined to crush that incipient realignment to ensure there was no chance of it ever happening again, which seems to be one of the things that lie in store for this Tory party. Thank you very much, Patrick. Excellent tweeting and column writing. Who died? Basically, the thrust was who died and made this guy king of the world. It's an interesting question, and we still don't have an answer. Thank you very much, Patrick O'Flynn. Let me know your thoughts. gbviews@gbnews.uk. The geniuses who run the Conservative Party now fret that they could be headed to an electoral debacle on the scale of 1997. In your dreams, you loser creeps. The danger is they're headed to a wipeout much closer to the 1993 Canadian Tories, when Her Majesty's incumbent government of Canada went to the country and was rewarded with just 2 seats. That's the Tory party down there on the bottom. So the opposition, they became the government, the Liberal opposition. Those three, like the Bloc Québécois, they're just the equivalent of the Scottish National Party and what have you, and they're down at the bottom. That's the Canadian Tories. Fantastic result. It's in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's smallest Conservative Party. But here's a thought. If you're going to lose anyway, and we're in for 5 years of Sir Neil Zalot and the Ginger Growler, isn't it better to lose 1993 style than 1997? In 1997, the John Major Tories survived sufficiently to stagger on. In 1993, the Canadian Tories split into the establishment Squish Party and a grassroots populist party that was powerful enough to keep the Liberal government semi-sane through the 90s. Far saner, in fact, than the UK's so-called Conservatives have been since 2010. In other words, if you want a realignment on the right, certain defeat is the best time to do that. And if there's one thing that can be said for certain, a party offering its membership a choice between Jeremy Sunak, Rishi Wallace or Ben Hunt is headed for certain defeat. Toby Young of the Daily Sceptic and the Free Speech Union, and someone who voted for Liz Truss as Tory leader, is here. Toby, Nigel just a few minutes ago was wondering what the point of this Conservative Party is. Do you have an answer to that?
I'm not sure I do, Mark. I think the reason Liz Truss has reduced the Conservative Party to a smoking ruin, and with reference to your earlier point about the decimation of the Conservative Party in Canada in 1993, if the latest polls, whereby I think Labour are 36 points ahead, were translated into seats, then the Conservatives would get so few that the SNP would be the official opposition, and Starmer would have a majority of something like 350. I think your prognosis is at the moment accurate. Where did it go wrong? Well, I think the problem Liz has is that she never really had the courage of her convictions. I'm one of these jihadists who think that the government didn't go nearly far enough in its libertarian tax-cutting, public expenditure-cutting agenda. I hoped, Liz Truss, the reason I voted for her, I hoped that she would cut public expenditure, reduce the national debt, roll back the frontiers of the state. And almost the first thing she announced as PM was this energy cap, whereby energy bills were going to be, the average energy bill was going to be capped at £2,500 a year. And that was going to cost the taxpayer $200 billion. Suddenly it was announced that the government, having spent $500 billion to pay people to not work during the pandemic, we're now going to spend another $200 billion to try and help them with their energy bills. And even in the mini budget itself, I thought there were some good things in that, the $45 billion in tax cuts, although they didn't really explain how that would actually, in the end, increase the total tax take because of the Laffer curve. But then they also said that they weren't going to cut public expenditure. So I think it's inevitable with the announcement they were going to spend $200 billion more, not going to cut public expenditure, coupling that with cutting taxes. It's not that surprising that the bond markets slightly freaked out, but she could have stuck to her guns nevertheless. But she didn't. She did a U-turn on cutting the top rate of tax, and then she fired Quasi, presumably in the hope that this would somehow help her survive. But actually, it's done the opposite, and now, she's a dead woman walking.
Well, the economy is, whatever it is after 2 years of lockdown and then Putin waging energy war on Europe and all the rest of it. But what about the cultural issues? We've had 12 years of conservatism, so-called. The country's never seemed less conservative. You try to point out to them that the so-called online safety bill is nothing a conservative government should really be getting mixed up with. Isn't this the best opportunity? And I know we're sentimental about these guys because they go back hundreds of years, but isn't this the best opportunity actually to launch a new force on the right?
Well, absolutely. And that's why I supported Kemi Badenoch as the leader of the Conservative Party in the first few rounds of the leadership contest, and only switched to Liz once she'd been eliminated. But I thought that she would lean into the culture wars. She's spoken out against critical race theory. She's spoken out against the indoctrination of children in schools, exposing them to gender identity ideology from the age of 4 onwards. She's been very courageous in speaking out on these big cultural issues, and that's why I thought she would have made such a good leader of the party. But I think the view of people like Liz and now people like Jeremy is that these things are a distraction. We don't want to get involved in the culture wars. It's an irrelevance. It doesn't mean much to most people. And you don't need to worry about things like censorship online, indoctrination of children in schools. These are peripheral. We need to worry about the economy, about bread and butter issues. I think that's a mistake. As you say, here was an opportunity after Boris's victory in 2019, winning over all those voters in red wall seats because they thought that he was on their side on these big cultural issues.
Yeah,
he was a conservative when it came to these big social questions, but he himself ducked most of those debates. He didn't really come out and defend Britain's heritage or Britain's statues and monuments during the Black Lives Matter protests. He and no member of his government ever really did anything about the police becoming the sort of paramilitary wing of the Guardian. They ducked those issues, and I think big mistake, and it was a big mistake of Liz not to lean into those issues, not to appoint Kemi as our education secretary instead of Kit Malthouse. But for some reason, she decided that wasn't the way to go.
But that distinction, Toby, between, I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal doesn't even work when you're socially liberal and fiscally rat-assed, which is the situation the present government is. They're not doing either half of the equation right now. We're going to take that up with John O'Sullivan and others in the rest of the show. Thank you very much, Toby. Appreciate it. Let me know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.uk. We get to your comments next. Plus, David Starkey and Ava Vlaardingerbroek all coming up in two shakes of a lamb's tail. Oh, sorry, breaking news. Jeremy Hunt has cancelled one of my lamb's tail shakes. Oh, what more breaking news now? He's cancelled the other to reassure the markets. Stay right there. We're coming straight back on GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
GB News is the People's Channel, so let's hear what the people have been saying. We wanted to know how you felt about Jeremy Hunt becoming Emperor of these islands. Lieutenant Colonel Kojak, possibly Lieutenant Colonel Kojak, says Hunt is an EU sycophant Ramona, a pro-immigration globalist, a climate alarmist, a World Economic Forum puppet, an appeaser of the Chinese Communist Party, and he was an ardent COVID fanatic. Yeah, but that's enough of all his good points. The British establishment right now is nodding along saying, yeah, you tell it, Lieutenant Colonel Kojak, he sounds great. But the tweet concludes, he's hated by Conservative voters. It's almost like that's the big plan, isn't it? Pauline says, I'm done now. Unless a new party is formed, I'm not voting. Cut all expenses for MPs, no more free meals and drinks. Let them pay their own way like the rest of the country. Mickey Mickey1 says he's not as bad as I've been imagining. I dread to think of what is in your imagination, Mickey. Norman says it's strange how the candidate with the least votes in the leadership contest becomes de facto PM within a month. Strange how the economic markets didn't like a chancellor that went against the World Economic Forum agenda. Schwab probably ordered Kwasi's sacking for someone more suitable. Yeah, I'd like to subpoena the telephone records from his hollowed-out Alp in Switzerland, old Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum. My next guest made the point on this show a couple of weeks back that since 1997, the UK has been ruled by one continuous new Labour government. The only remotely conservative policy they have enacted was Brexit, after a fashion, and that was imposed on them by outside forces that they then spent years trying to subvert. On the other hand, just 3 years ago, incredible as it seems, Brexit, or the combination of Brexit and a charismatic opportunist as leader, won them their biggest majority in half a century, basically. Dr. David Starkey is back with us. David, what do you make? I mean, we should point out, as you surely know, that she has to hang on for a bit. I think for another 2 months, just to equal the shortest reign of any British Prime Minister.
True, but we're in extraordinary times. Remember, the Romans had a year of 4 emperors. We've just had a decade, 4 prime ministers, and we're almost certainly going to have a year of 3. Now, this points to absolutely fundamental things that are going wrong. I think the first of them, clearly, this is a Tory problem within the Tory party. As you've been describing it, the Tory party doesn't believe in anything. It is a chaos of rival factions, all of whom hate each other rather more than they actually hate the opposition. So it's disintegrating into factions. And there are reasons for this. I mean, the pride of so many Conservatives right from the beginning, really, was that conservatism is a kind of tradition, and of course we're flexible. We are practical people, and the result is, of course, if you have a party without any fundamental bedrock, it's like that wonderful remark about G.K. Chesterton. Once you stop believing in God, you don't believe in nothing. You believe in anything. As the Tory party doesn't believe in nothing, well, it believes in anything. This extraordinary chaos which we have. There are particular figures, I think, that are responsible for this. David Cameron and George Osborne have an enormous responsibility because of the deliberate saying, oh, we don't want old-fashioned Tory candidates, who might actually have a few old-fashioned Tory ideas. We want, Cameron's cuties. Anybody who looks fashionable, is a little bit diverse, has the odd touch of something or another. So that's part of the story. And then where do we continue? Leaders that are chosen oddly and that also lack conviction. You were talking about Boris. Boris fundamentally believed in only one thing, himself. I would say probably the same is true of Cameron and the same is true of Theresa May, and certainly also of, I'm almost forgetting her name. Can you remind me of well, she's called Liz Truss, isn't she? Anyway, these are little tiny people. They're little tiny people. And at least Boris had something of the manner of a prime minister in the sense of the rhetoric. Theresa May had a little bit in the sense of gravitas. David Cameron had, that superficial smoothness. But finally, we've got the absolute reductio ad absurdum. We've got somebody who's got no quality of a prime minister. I was astonished, actually, listening to my dear friend, and who is the organizer of an organization that I believe passionately in, the Free Speech Union, saying he'd actually voted Liz. I took one look at both she and Sunak in that first debate and thought, frankly, I can't.
That's very interesting, David. Very interesting. You know, you look at the big historical sweep. There are parties that were around and were powerful for most of the 19th century. Electors in Great Britain and Ireland basically voted for one of two parties in every seat. And just almost exactly a century ago, Lloyd George went to the palace, tendered his resignation to the king, and I'm sure left the palace having no idea he would be the very last Liberal Prime Minister to hold office.
Absolutely. And it's exactly 100 years ago. It's 1922, 2022. And I wrote, interestingly enough, a couple of months ago, an article for The Critic pointing out the staggering resemblances between Boris and Lloyd George in terms of personal immorality, an old-fashioned word, personal corruption of one sort or another, but at the same time, that wonderful phrase that's used by my predecessors, A.J.P. Taylor, the combination of, in the government of both of them, there is brilliance and sordidness, that extraordinary doubleness. But of course, and again, all the sorts of innovations, you know, why does Boris do what he did? Because, of course, and we haven't talked about this, he's dealing with a kind of quasi-war. COVID was a sort of war. We incurred, you pointed out, $500 billion, the sort of costs that you do in war. We've then given ourselves another war with our response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and our further response and the extraordinary business of subsidizing fuel costs. So we've had the equivalent of a war, and we've had all sorts of special measures to deal with war. That was exactly what Lloyd George did. He was a wartime prime minister. But of course, the war's over. You're in the aftermath. We're now looking back at the horror of the mess. We spent this money and we haven't even defeated the Germans. I'm afraid it looks as though Boris will do, with all those parallels to Lloyd George, he will do to the Tories, and I predicted it, what Lloyd George did to Liberal. He will kill the party. And it is manifestly a dying party. You witness a sort of folly, the disunion and the absurdity. But there's a final point, which I think we really do need to put into the picture. So we've got this business of a lack of ideological foundation. We've got the emergence of leaders from a very shallow political class with actually no sense of ideological commitment, the complete opposite of Margaret Thatcher, people with no anchorage. But we have got something else. Ever since Gordon Brown, more and more of the fabric of public life has been handed over to quangos and so-called expert bodies. Look at the behaviour of the Bank of England in this. Look at the behaviour of the Office of, Budget Responsibility and all the rest of it. These, in a sense, have become a shadow government. Look at the reactions of your viewers. That profound, our view, that profound sense of disenchantment, that profound sense of people tell us we, the voters, are sovereign. Oh, we're not. We're treated as fools. Treated simply as dispensable fools. The trouble is, of course, that our constitution, which in many ways has worked so well, enables this to happen. I mean, I was a little bit puzzled about the conversation we were having with our friend from the Specky. What's happened is constitutionally perfectly acceptable. As you said, the nominal prime minister, that wonderful term of George Osborne, Pino, prime minister in name only, not Tina, there is no alternative, but Pino, it sounds like a kind of, well, it sounds rather disgusting, doesn't it? But something unpleasant that you have to drink. But she nominated him, and so long as it is not a vote of no confidence of ours, that is enough for it to be constitutional. But of course, for it to be politically sensible, for it to be politically viable, for it to be the kind of behaviour for a party that wants to be re-elected, even to survive, well...
No, that's very true, David, and you're quite right about the rise of the Quango state, which is not provided for, but it does suggest a permanent government and that the fruitling concerns of voters can nibble away this or that on the edge of it, but that the centrality of life is determined by the permanent state and all those quangos, off this and off that and off everybody, off the voters particularly. Thank you, David. It is always great to see you. It's terrific to see you. A couple of weeks ago, I want to make sure we get this in. We played you this clip of the head of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab. Herr Schwab is, as you know, he's the sinister Teutonic megalomaniac hiding in plain sight as a sinister Teutonic megalomaniac, and he claims to have penetrated all the cabinets.
What we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
Oh, really? You don't say. Don't you hate it when you come home at night and there's Klaus Schwab penetrating your cabinet? But he's perfectly upfront about it. Ministers of the Crown in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and yes, the mother country are beholden to him and his agenda, and local elections are just a bit of theatre to nibble away at the policy edges. As you know, there's been scaffolding all over the Palace of Westminster for a while now, and a year or two back some wag stuck this on it. Quote, "Vote Tory, get Klaus Schwab." Well, the Conservative base has just had a sharp lesson in the truth of that dictum. They voted for the second coming of Thatcher, and they've wound up with a near parody of globalist groupthink whose model for COVID policy is the Chinese Communist Party.
Very much agree with the central point in Gabriel's paper that we should be aiming for zero infection and elimination of the disease, because that is basically the approach taken in countries which have a SARS strategy as opposed to a flu strategy. And those are the countries that have overwhelmingly been the most successful in tackling coronavirus. My sister lives in Beijing, and she flew back to Beijing in the middle of lockdown. And just to give you an idea of the contrast, she was escorted from the airport in Beijing to her home by Ministry of Health officials, and then put into her home for 2 weeks quarantine. The door was sealed, and she had a police car sitting outside her house periodically. And I'm not saying we go that far in this country.
Oh, you're not saying we should go that far in this country, but there's a man so on board with the Chi-Com program, he's happy to have his sister walled up in Peking. That is awfully generous. Now, one thing, it's odd, because we have all this pandemic, and this guy wants Chinese rules on the pandemic, yet oddly enough, we've had 3 years of pandemic, and 3 years of open borders, because even though you've got a pandemic, you're supposed to keep your borders open to anyone you want, and that has terrible consequences. Eva Verladingerbroek joins me now with a terrible, horrible story of what happened to a 12-year-old girl in Paris. Tell us about this young lady, Eva.
Yes, I woke up this morning to see the news of another young girl, European girl, who was sacrificed on the altar of mass migration. This is the case of Lola. She's 12 years old. She lives in the 19th arrondissement in Paris, and she was found dead this morning in a suitcase with her throat slit open and marks imprinted on her body. She was raped, tortured, and then eventually killed. And we have 4 people in custody. All migrants coming from Algeria, one of them supposedly also an illegal immigrant in France. And she is one of many. She's obviously not the first one. There are many examples that come to mind. And apparently this happens about This is the 12th girl, I believe, in France that has been killed this year by an immigrant. And that's just France. We all know that there are many more. So I mean, I saw this poor little girl's face, and it just breaks your heart. It's horrible.
No, a 12-year-old girl, and as you say, marks imprinted on her body, which suggests that when these people are done with her, they finished raping her, they then harvest her body for body parts which they sell. And we've already had reports in the UK of children going missing from some of these so-called asylum hotels. Western governments are actively collaborating with these gangs in child sex trafficking and the sale of body parts. Why is it that you can't even, in most countries, it doesn't even make the news?
It doesn't make the news because obviously these are the unwanted consequences of the policies that they are pushing. So they don't want you to know that their open border policies have these types of consequences. When we were talking about our government, but also about the World Economic Forum and about the idea of world governance, of course, wanting no borders, wanting one government, one people is one of their main goals. So then you don't want people to know what happens when you have open borders, and that the idea of one people, the idea that all cultures are equal is actually not true and ends up killing the most vulnerable and the most young and the most innocent in our society. But that is most definitely the case, and the people who speak out about it are labeled for that same reason far-right fascist. But there is truth to it. Yeah. This is something new that's been happening to our society. And every time you hear about it, there is a systematic overrepresentation of people coming from radically different cultures that do this to young girls. And we have to start speaking the truth about it.
Yes, we do, because we've lost the basic sense. People at one point used to understand. You're Dutch. You know that in Belgium there's historically been great differences between Flemish and Walloon. Even small differences can cause long-term problems. We're actually building up our own funeral pyre with this crazy open borders stuff.
Oh, yes, and absolutely. And like I said, the vulnerable and the young, our kids are the ones being sold out by the establishment first. And that is what you see here. And I just can't stand seeing another photo of another young, innocent girl, helpless girl, on my social media feed anymore. I'm tired of repeating the same words every time, saying that I'm so shocked, saying that I'm so horrified. What needs to happen is these borders need to be closed. We need to know who is coming in, and we need to start sending people who do this and people who have no business being here back. It's that simple. But as long as that does not happen, as long as we keep electing people that are part of these organizations, such as the World Economic Forum, that want this, and that we understand that this is their plan. They want a uprooting of our people. They want the destruction of our identity, and they want the destruction of the nation state. Then nothing will change.
Well, you said it, Eva, that we're sacrificing our young girls on the altar of diversity. It's a terrible thing. It's an evil thing, and we should stop doing it. Thank you very much. Stump the Steyn looms, GB Views at gbnews.uk. And one of Mrs. Thatcher's closest aides is with us, John O'Sullivan. Don't touch that dial. We're coming right back.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Tory leadership elections were introduced half a century back after the old system, soundings by party elders, had thrown up Alec Douglas Hume, who was a 14th Earl and mocked mercilessly as such by Labour and the media. And the Tories did what they always do, which is basically internalise their enemies' critique of them, and so they started grumbling that in the era of mini-skirted dolly birds and swinging Carnaby Street, their man had, quote, the whiff of the grouse war. The whiff of the grouse moor. The whiff, wouldn't you love the whiff of the grouse moor today? No whiff of the grouse moor with today's Tories, alas. In over 50 years of party leadership elections, every Conservative Prime Minister but one has been a dud, a failure, el stinko floppo. The lone exception to that rule is the lady my next guest worked for, former advisor to Mrs. Thatcher, now heading up the Danube Institute in Budapest. John O'Sullivan joins us. John, what do you make of the last 72 hours or so?
Well, I think they're a farce, kind of a depressing farce. You know, I think I'm in the Guinness Book of Records as the man who lied about his age to join the Young Conservatives. So I'm kind of a sort of dyed-in-the-wool Tory. But I'm really depressed now because you can't look at what's happening at the moment and think this is a sensible way to run a government. That's the first thing the voters want, a competent party. The second thing they want is a united party. They're getting neither. And the third is they want a party that actually does what they want and vote for. And on the biggest issue, in my view, one of the biggest issues, namely immigration, they have promised for the last 12 years to halt or reverse or reduce immigration, and it has risen. And they have excuses, but the excuses are completely implausible. After all, the judges may oppose it, but Parliament makes the rules ultimately, and if it bows to the judges or doesn't do what the voters want, it's going to run into the buffers in a big way, and that is what is happening now. And I don't think there's any sympathy at all in the electorate for the government. I'm sorry about that for the sake of my old party, but I'm beginning to think Peter Hitchens is right. It probably has to die for a new, genuine Conservative Party to be born. I'm not saying that definitely, but it's looking that way.
Well, you were my editor in Canada when our friend Conrad Black launched the National Post. And one of the reasons he did that was actually to support the creation of a new Conservative Party because the existing Conservative Party had outlived its usefulness. Conservatism, as opposed to just the modish twerps we've had since Cameron, to actually get on and actively start planning that.
Well, that might have happened in the last election campaign, because if you remember, Nigel Farage had created an alternative genuine Conservative movement, actually. And when the time comes, he was challenged for, well, he was offered the choice, either stand against the Conservatives in all seats and Brexit won't happen, Labour will win, you'll split the vote. And he essentially, for patriotic pro-Brexit reasons, he decided to swallow his pride, and stand down against the Conservatives in seats they held. Now, I think, in retrospect, what happened there was very significant. Boris and Nigel, but more Boris, had the choice to either unite Conservative opinion in Britain and get a huge majority in the genuine Conservative Party by, in effect, merging the two, even if they have two names in Parliament, or do you unite the traditional Conservative vote and tell the other lot, well, you're welcome in the seats which we need, but we're not going to give you any help to win the seats that you need to get going. I think that was a key moment, and I think that Boris made the wrong decision. And, of course, that's partly because Boris did believe in Brexit, I believe, but he didn't believe most of the other things, particularly control of immigration, that his supporters, and people like me, did believe.
But isn't that an easier call next year or the year after, or whenever the next election happens? Because right now, under, Liz Truss or Jeremy Whatnot or Sunak or Ben Wallace or whoever, this party is going down. You can take that to the bank. And in that case, isn't this the odds of a new party succeeding are actually better this time?
They certainly are, and they're better for a particular reason as well, which is that the biggest reason for voting Tory for some time has been, leave aside Brexit, has been the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, whether you believe its transformation under Keir Starmer or not, is presenting itself as a much more moderate, responsible, and indeed patriotic party. Now, I think they can recite the words. I don't believe they can hum the music even. So I don't think that's persuasive. But it is persuasive to the degree that they're not frightening the living daylights out of you. And that, I think, is really bad news for the Tories.
No, you're right. They've certainly memorised the words of "God Save the Queen." It doesn't look as "God Save the King." It doesn't look as if it's quite taken off with them emotionally speaking, John. I mean, I know you've been a lifelong Tory, but it is incredible to me that when you look, as I said, when you look back to the 14th Earl of Hume and all the duds that's come along, there is something in the organisation of the Tory party that seems to throw up wrong leaders almost routinely.
Well, I'm not sure that Alec Douglas Hume was a wrong leader. He inherited the leadership of the Tory party.
I don't mean Alec. I was thinking of everyone since him.
Okay. He was. But by the way, I should tell you, the first interesting political speech I ever heard was by Isaac Deutscher, the far left historian of biographer of Trotsky, and addressing a group of university conservative students, and he abused them. He corrected them. He said, "You keep attacking Alec Douglas Hume as a meaningless figure. He has revived the Conservative Party by stressing the defence issue." And he was right. So I never write off a party completely until the votes are all in. But having said that, who among this rather miserable lot is appealing as a political leader? The one I would say most at the moment is probably the defence minister, but that's because we know almost nothing about his domestic political views. A lot of military men are quite left-wing domestically.
Yeah, no, that is true. There's an awful lot of chiefs of staff and the like that I wouldn't want going anywhere near politics. Thank you very much, John O'Sullivan. Let's stub it out quickly. What have we got? Bunny says, "Mark, your socks, do they match your tie?" I'm not wearing any socks. The wardrobe budget doesn't stretch to socks or indeed trousers. If you see the director's cut of this show, which you can subscribe to, we've got a side camera that will reveal all that. That's going to do it. Mark Dolan's here for Dan Wooden to macerate your Monday. He's wearing socks and trousers. What you got, Dan? What you got,
well,
Mark?
Look, it's a very busy show. It's a government in crisis special, Mark. If the Tories get rid of Liz Truss, will it save the government? Will it save the Tory party? We've got Anne Widdecombe live in the studio and Boris Johnson's dad, Stanley. Should Bojo make the ultimate comeback? Lots to get through. Mark, a busy 2 hours. We're live at 9.
I love that Jobo, Mark. I don't know what it means, but it sounds dirty. It's all coming up with Mark after the weather. Stay safe, stay free.
Good evening, Alex Deakin here with your latest weather updates. Turning a bit misty overnight, so a few fog patches likely, which could be fairly slow to clear tomorrow morning. But for most, tomorrow is going to be a dry and a bright day with some spells of sunshine. There are low pressure systems dominating, but one is moving away, and this one's only making slow progress in. So actually in between, most places becoming dry and clear overnight. Still a few showers this evening over northern parts of Scotland. We'll keep a few going over the Northern Isles, Caithness, Sutherland and Aberdeenshire, but otherwise it's going to be dry for most through the night. And the winds will ease off as well after a fairly blustery day across the north. Light winds, clear skies means a bit of a chilly one. Temperatures likely to dip down close to freezing in rural spots of Northern Ireland. A chilly start and a foggy start as well. Parts of Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northern England, down across East Wales and the Midlands. Some fog, as I say, could take a while to clear through the morning as well. But once that's gone, it's dry and bright for the vast majority. Still the odd shower over the Northern Isles, Aberdeenshire, and maybe one or two for Devon and Cornwall. But I say most places dry and bright. And temperatures in the south, again, getting into the mid to high teens. Still feeling quite chilly across northern Scotland, although the winds will be a lot lighter compared to today. Light winds and clear skies allowing for another chilly one across parts of Scotland, but a change down to the southwest as cloud starts to thicken and showery rain drifts northwards, at first over southwest England into Wales, and then during Wednesday we'll see some of that wet weather pushing northwards into parts of the Midlands, eventually northern England and Northern Ireland too. Some of the bursts of rain could be on the heavy side. Quite a lot more cloud then across the south on Wednesday compared to Tuesday, and the wind starting to pick up once more. Still quite mild here, but temperatures further north also ticking up a little bit with a bit more sunshine here during Wednesday. Feeling quite pleasant, I suspect, in western Scotland. Low pressure continues to dominate. Bands of wet and windy weather swinging north this week, but coming from the south, it's always going to stay pretty mild.